I do have to start these talks off for kind of the experience that I've had. That I'm not here representing any U.S. Any part of the U.S. government or any particular agency thereof. But for those of you that aren't familiar a little bit with my background, I did serve at the U.S. Cyber Command as their first scholar in residence, and when you go back 6 years ago, would I be thinking when I walked in the invitation of Admiral Rogers that we would actually achieve this, Alexander Georgian crossing the bridge of theory and policy? Thought they would tolerate me for a little bit and then move on. Right? But so if you told me I'd have the next commander writing a foreword to the book, outing us as sort of the intellectual anchors to where the strategy has gone, that's way beyond what one would expect as an academic. So what I'll try to do is give you sort of a nutshell version of the theory. We can talk about the context for it if you'd like in conversation, and then try to give you a few sort of key indicators on the strategy side, policy side, and a quick overview of the Biden national cyber strategy that was released a week ago Thursday, which aligns with the expectations of this theory, which was not a guarantee, right? And we can talk about that on the bureaucratic politics side of things and all that type. But an interesting ride as a political scientist, being able to take that hat off and actually say, you know what, our theories, both at the IR level, but also at the foreign policy, bureaucratic and organizational process theories, they actually do capture this place. And navigating it to ultimately create a pivot at the strategy, the national strategy level, and then at the operational level, took some doing. Lots of good people willing to actually think through new ideas. So with that caveat and background, let's see if it works for us. Okay, so is there a way to move that top closed captioning? There we go. Okay, so let's just start off. The book argues that one way to conceive of the security space, the international security space, is to recognize that we are actually dealing with three different strategic environments that have an element of logic that is distinguishing. Right? Two, we argue in the book, nuclear and conventional still flow from a coercive notion of and logic of coercion. Right? And then this curiosity, this new one, right, in which we actually argue has sufficient structural differences to actually have produced a logic of security that is distinct from the other. And part of the problem that the United States and other Western allied partners had was that they hadn't recognized, right? So they were applying, we argue, misapplying, right, the assumptions from both the conventional and nuclear environment. We can talk more about that in discussion, right? But the idea behind this argument of a strategic environment is that rather than this mix of security resting on an offense or defense advantage and how good you are at managing that balance of technical, tactical, and operational offensive and defensive capabilities, or a security environment that's actually offense dominant. And offense dominant means offense dominant. Right? It means we literally got the metaphor right. You press a button and you get an effect, right? The other side does not have a mitigating capacity. That would be defense, right? A mitigating capacity to reduce the destructive potential, right? In the nuclear environment. So we get to, a very simple proposition, 1946. I always go back to the absolute left of Bernard Brodie. I don't know that we've actually done much in the way of even advancing that core idea since then, right? And that was that you had to figure out a new way to secure when you couldn't. And the idea was to convince the other side not to attack in the first place. That's in the essence boiling down a bumper sticker of where deterrence is. All right, so well, oh, that might have been because there we go. All right, so what do we mean by initiative persistence, right? Understand that the subset title of the book is a redefinition of national security. And we can talk, again, at the strategy level, this was really hard to get across, right? Because we, in the United States and many other countries around the world, we had defined security for 70 years, ultimately being operationalized as the absence of action, right? I mean, if deterrence is working, the other side's not doing something, and they didn't attack it. And I would sit when we were presenting this at the congressional level and dealing with one particular senator important in this area, but remain nameless. We talked for about 45 minutes, a lot of good body language, head nodding, everything else. Okay, but question, one question I was just not really sure on. So, like, how do we deter? Right? And you realize, okay, we got a long way to go. And I walked out of that meeting, and that's when I went back and read Kuhn. I went back to the structure of scientific revolutions and realized paradigms are stable, right? That the way we conceive, even if we've got new information sitting in front of us, right? That I'm going to take that square peg and I'm going to really try to put it into that round hole, right? Because even though I see different empirical evidence, right, that this doesn't seem to be working, I'm captured by the theories, the logics, the established organizational structures, right? And that's what we were dealing with back in 2016, 17, and still to this day, right? In terms of trying to get this through. So we were very explicit in the book, right? That this is, if you're going to be comfortable in this space based on cyber persistence theory, you have to accept the actually redefinition of the operationalization of security, right? And that operationalization means it is a space in which there will be action being taken by the adversary, right? Whoever that might be. And the question becomes, how do you manage that action? It's not going to come down operationalizing this as the action. So the interesting thing about an initiative persistent environment is that there is the capability and the possibility for defense. So if you look at the Russian-Ukrainian case, if you guys want to talk about that, happy to do so to the extent that I can. I think this shows a lot about how much anticipatory preparation matters in this space, right? So you can defend, but you only defend in the moment of the configuration of the network that you've anticipated, right? The software versions, the hardware versions, and the processes that network those things together, right, are constantly changing. We're in this fluid environment. So can you anticipate the exploitation that's going to happen in that space? Then you got a chance to secure yourself. Right? But when you look at the actual technical space and how it relates to security, there is no real attrition in this space. Right? I can repurpose at very low cost, whether it be an attack vector, whether it be the actual code that I'm leveraging, right, and everything else that's linking that together. So that there is no diminishing return that I, as a defender, can rely on. So if that holds, if you accept that notion that you can't attrit for security, then it leaves you with this logical extension, right? That I have to persist operation. But that persistence has to actually lead to what? what produces, what's the causal mechanism behind security? And what we argue, it is initiative. It's the cyber initiative, right? It's anticipating exploitation before it actually. That is the ultimate objective, right? That will produce more relative security for you relative to the other side. But if you are willing to accept this notion that it is a fluid technical environment that drives behavior on a regular basis, and the other side is going to persist as much as you are, you're going to have a bad day, right? You're not going to, across this vulnerability landscape, be perfect, right? In fact, expecting perfection, right, is going to leave you a lot to explain. Eddie better. Right. So where do we start? On the nuclear side of things, many moons ago, in a life that I had back in the late 1980s, I was sort of more Waltzian than Waltz with regard to nuclear stability and nuclear deterrence, right? And differentiating it from the contestable environment of the conventional strategic environment. And that's what I sort of was dealing with and known for in my beginning of my career. And it was about applying that to this new thing called the browser, right? And a browser that was going to be networked ubiquitously. And it was a DoD study that I was asked to do that sort of launched me working on this for the last 30 some odd years. So I'm a big fan of parsing, right? And so in the end, I'm somewhat of a structuralist. And we could talk about how that relates to IR theory and realism in a few minutes. But ultimately, when we try to look at, is there some sort of systemic structural variables that can help us parse out an expectation about behavior? That's what structural theory is. What is that expectation of patterns of behavior? And so going back to sort of fundamentals, we argue in the book that there is a structure to the cyber strategic environment that rests on these three main pieces, right? Interconnected. So you can't find, and the Biden administration did it again, you can't find a policy document, right, that says within its first page doesn't say cyberspace, global and interconnected, right? Or some version of that. But for about 30 years, what would follow on the policy side would be segmentation, right? It would be traditional bureaucratic approaches, terrestrial approaches, right? It wouldn't actually look at interconnectedness as a structural barrier. So if it is interconnected, then let's accept that as a starting point. What does that mean from a conditionality? If you're in an interconnected space, and this is, in terms of the theory, I would submit to you, in terms of folks that have written about it to date, this is what they get most wrong, right? Is this notion of constant contact. We argue in the book that constant contact is the condition that flows from being in an interconnected structure. Right? By definition, if you are interconnected, you are in constant contact with your neighbor, right? Your business community, the rest of your nation, every other nation, every other citizen, and oh yes, by the way, your adversary. And that is fundamentally different than a territorial environment that is based on the principle of segmentation. Because contact in a segmented environment is by definition episodic, potential, over the horizon. Because you're starting off structurally in a segmented space. So my contact with you requires one extra step. That extra step might be crossing your border, right? And so we've organized international relations by saying, those border things, you got to be invited across them, right? If you come across aggressively, we're going to define that as a different kind of context for international relations. We're going to call that right? And we're going to build a whole set of international legal structures to manage that state of affairs. That's different when we're not crossing each other's borders uninvited. That conversation goes away if you accept the notion that you're in an interconnected space of constant. So constant contact is not a policy choice. It's a condition that flows from the structure. And that's what most folks get wrong when they start talking about the theory and policy context. But then you add this extra layer that the technology itself, so just as the technology of nuclear fission fusion drove a whole new set of logic, right, for that strategic environment, we argue that the unique characteristics of this technology, aside from its structural notion of interconnectedness and what flows from that constant contact, that the technology itself, right, is a structural barrier in understanding that it is a fluid, ubiquitously accessible, and inherently exploitable, we say inherently vulnerable, right, technology. It's just in the nature of the way we constructed this. Did we have to do it that way? No, right? But from the origins of the Harknett and forward, we made base assumptions about how to organize this space. And we've been layering on that technology ever since. And those layers never fundamentally altered that description, right? That it fluidly reconfigures, is ubiquitously accessible, and inherently vulnerable. So all we've done is doubled, tripled, quadrupled, and whatever numbers follow from that, on that nature of that technology. When you take those three things together, that you're in an interconnected space, which creates constant contact with everyone in that space, and the technology itself is fluid, ubiquitously accessible, that means everybody that you're connected with, right, has access to your sources of national power at some level. Most of it's very minor. Individuals, they can do some disruptive things if they're really capable in this space, right? But if I can actually do this with intention over time, the access issue is solved, relatively speaking, because of the opportunity that the nature of the technology enables me to exploit. I have to assume that there's somewhere, someone, pretty much every minute of every day, right, that has the opportunity to shift relative power. Right? Not everybody wants to do it. Right? Some want to do it just for economic reasons. Right? They want a better share of the market. Right? Some of them want to win more baseball games. Right? So the St. Louis Cardinals actually hacked the Houston Astros database on farm league folks, right? And know who they're going to recruit. Even though Cardinals and the Astros have been winning more titles than anybody else in the decade, right? So no matter who you are, you see this space, right, that you can take advantage and move your relative position in that space. Right? And so in structuralist terms, we argue that this space actually rewards, right? There's actually a reward system incentive, right, to finding where you can move and shift that relative power. And so you can sit back and allow everybody else to do that, right? And seed that initiative to them. And over time, there will be a consequence, right? A structural consequence to them. You're going to have less capacity than those folks. So we argue it's an imperative. That's a really strong word, right? To say there's an imperative to persist in seeking the initiative, right? It's people say, well, you know, isn't there some agency? Isn't there some choice? Sure. So it was Harrison, yes, right? So Harrison, I would submit to you that you have an imperative to breathe. Okay, you have the choice to hold your breath. Right? And if you were really good at holding your breath, you could hold your breath till you pass out. Right? I don't know if that's a good idea, or not, right? But you still have agency. But I would say breathing falls into the category of an imperative, right? It's not a simple choice. You're not sitting there choosing to do it. If you want to live, you have to breathe, right? You can choose not to, and you're probably not going to live, okay? We're arguing the same holds in cyberspace. You can choose not to seek the initiative, right? To persist in seeking that. You can choose that, but there will be consequences for that because the imperative drives you, right, to trying to set the conditions of your own security. And that's what's fascinating about this space, right? Is that you can actually get in there and through the use of code, take advantage of other cyber vulnerabilities for the purposes of gaining strategic advantage. When I use the word strategic advantage or the phrase advantage in this context, what we're talking about is shifting relative power at the national source level. So I can shift through this space over time, cumulatively, the expectation, come back to that, underline that 3 times. Expectation is that I could gain economic advantage, right, through manipulation, through exploitation. Some of it may be just IP theft, right? So if I take your R&D that you've been spending, a couple $2 billion on, you've built the infrastructure to produce this research and development, and I'm able to walk that out the door, plug and play that into an implementation production facility. Now I'm going to market at a much lower cost because I don't have to make up that R&D. That's a gain in economic advantage that I never get back. To that same theft, if I take all the current R&D on your undersea military capability, and anybody, well, you guys all study this, right? You know, it takes a long time to build military capability that's innovative, right? So if you got your R&D and saying, this is where I'm going to be 10 years from now, and your adversary actually pulls that completely out. Reportedly, Chinese have done this to the United States. I know where you're planning on being for 10 years. What the hell do you do now? Do you continue on plans that your adversary can now anticipate? Right? So if you're successful in building what you're planning on building, they actually are already there on the defense side, the mitigation side. An interesting dilemma, right? But have I actually changed military balance, right, through that exploitation, just simply through scale, right? A scaled effect. We argue that that's different than just traditional intelligence, espionage, right? Good old extraction of information. It's actually strategic, right? It's having a strategic effect in that particular military. So when we observe this space, our argument was, Hollywood doesn't have this right. It's not this keyboard to keyboard hacker moment, right, in which we're engaged, battling between our networks and stuff. Most of this is what we call a cyber fait accompli. Right? It is, in fact, going in and setting and resetting the conditions of security and insecurity direct to your advantage. Most of the time, this is a limited unilateral gain at a target's expense. We're still, private sector breach detection still averaging about 180 days, right? And there's no direct engagement going on there, right? What you're doing is cleaning up on aisle 9, right? You've had your network reset, and I'm using network in a very broad kind of context. But you've had your digital space reset to the advantage of somebody else. It may or may not disadvantage you. It depends on what that reset is, right? But you're either unaware of it in most cases, you're unable to do something about it, and in some cases, you're actually unwilling to respond. Right? So the initial response, say, for example, of Iran to the discovery of stuff, right? There was political incentive not to admit that this was an actual cyber attack, right? Until they got their heads around. So very different than where the literature had been before, when you were focused in from a deterrent framing, you were looking at the big attack, right? You would know when you were attacked, when your electric grid goes down, right? When your things that would have crossed that threshold of armed attack equivalence. That's not where the action is. The action has been below that threshold. And so then you have to actually apply strategic analysis and say, well, why is that? There's a structural imperative and there's a strategic choice reinforcing. So war is really, really messy. War is really unpredictable. Just ask the Russian leadership. And in fact, ask Ukrainian leadership and ask the US leadership that didn't think the Ukrainian leadership was actually going to be still Ukrainian a year out, right? When this thing started. War is really messy, really costly. And if you were in the international system in 2020, in the 2020s, 2023, and you're not satisfied with where you are in the international system, right? It means you got to primarily try to move the United States, move its relative power. You really want to go to war with the United States. Big power, right? Explicit war, very costly. But if I could start to undermine, right, some of that advantage, well short of it. If I can mess around with economics, if I could mess around with military advantage through R&D, right? If your government relies on democratic trust to function, right, as a core notion of where your power actually comes from, and I can start to facilitate the undermining of that, why wouldn't I do that? Right? Why wouldn't I advantage myself through those types of things, well short of what the United States national security strategy was saying was off the table? So if you look at the pivot that occurs in the 2018 Department of Defense cyber strategy, page 4 says explicit. These rivals that we're most concerned with are deterred from attacking and have chosen, right, to actually go below the threshold of armed attack. And the question is, now, how do we manage that space? And that's what cyber persistence theory is mainly trying to argue, but I'll suggest the update that we're working on in the second book is how you structure for contingency for both crisis and conflict. But it's primarily about leveraging the human eye. So let me try to wrap this up in 5 minutes so we can chat. That's the visual, kind of the Kissinger-esque visual of strategy, right? We got red versus blue, you know the place, you know the board, you know all the pieces, right? And then it's a matter of how adept are you in the to and fro on this space, right? My visual of cyberspace goes something like this, right? So the board is constantly morphing, right? So since we started this seminar today, that board's changed. There's some new version of software that's been released that I didn't anticipate as a defender that may actually be a space for exploitation, right? So there's additional space on that board to play. And then there's a whole bunch of different actors in terms of motivation. So that red-blue model, that's the strategic environment is about state action. And I'm sorry, remind me of your name. Sarah. This is, part of, going back, and I don't want to get you in trouble on your comps, right? So be careful about this since it hasn't been public, right? You go back to Morgenthau. There's a reason why he lands on state as the primary actor. And it's not because there's something inherent about the state. It's because the state has the capacity to act in international relations. Okay. The question now is, do we have other actors that can have consequence at a strategic level that affect relative power, right? So I had a chance to talk with Eric Schmidt once, small little group like this, right? And I said, hey, look, I do strategic analysis. I'm thinking about AI capability, right? Broadly defined. I would argue the leading AI actor in the world right now is China in terms of computing capacity, math. Everybody's got the math, right? Most advanced states got pretty good computers. They got really good computers. They got really good behavioral data, right? Because they don't have a thing called civil liberties. They don't have, right? So they're sucking up a level of behavioral data that on the Western side, we put some limits on. And that is a structural advantage, right, that we need to think about in terms of if we're using machine learning and GAN and stuff like that to advance. So are we actually at a structural advantage? And I think, yeah, the United States, maybe third, fourth, and where you put Israel, right? But I would put Alphabet as 2, right? In terms of just pure capacity, pure capability. And so I said, so the question I have for you is, how do I understand China's a strategic actor? I understand the United States is a strategic actor. But how do I understand Alphabet as a strategic actor? Right? Where do I put them on this game board? And his answer was, well, we're an American company, so we follow American rules. And I said, well, first of all, there's not much in the way of regulations in this space. And that doesn't really help me, right? In terms of what's driving your behavior, you're making calculations. And in fact, you're deploying capability. You're actually deploying capability faster than these states, right? And that gives you some behavioral examples. He didn't really like it, right? So I didn't get a good answer. But if we fast forward to 2022, and we're all political scientists in this room, right? How do you define a governmental system in which one person makes the decision? What do we classify that as? Label that? Dictatorship, authoritarian, might be monarchical, right? So how do I look at a single decision maker, right, who has had incredible impact at the operational level of this war, and the Ukrainians, I could posit, would not actually still be fighting and succeeding on the battlefield without Starlink, right? And Starlink, one guy who made that decision, right, to line up with the Ukrainians. So we have corporate cyber power, right, as a player on this space that's not enabling military. Right? They're not delivering capability. Right? They're actually through a state, right? They're delivering it directly. And the United States had no planning for that. NATO had no planning with that. Right? This is the world we're moving into, right? It's really, really messy. So the theory tries to take that messiness and bring it down. So I won't go through stability, persistent engagement. You guys have heard about it, but basically the idea is to continuously anticipate and exploit vulnerabilities while denying the ability to exploit ours. It has a whole bunch of different elements. This will be in the slide that I give you. Defend forward. Big error that folks make about defend forward, right, is this notion of just thinking about it in geographic. The most important aspect of defend forward as it relates to cyber persistence theory is its temporal time. You're defending forward in time. The time that it takes the adversary to build capability to exploit your vulnerabilities. That's the whole point of initiative. Can I actually get ahead of that cycle? Right? That's where the defense is forward. It's forward in time as much as it is in getting into the networks of others. Does that make sense? Right? And that gets sort of overlooked in a lot of this. So the US 22 defense strategy, if you look at it, I want to just note one of the big emphasis that is relevant in this space is this notion of campaign, right? And so one of the big changes shift was to stop thinking about cyber aggression as attack, hack, incident. Those are all episodic. That's not what's happening. Like, those are not the national security threat level types of outcomes. It is the accumulation of advantage over time that only comes through integrated operations, or in military terms, campaigns. And so if the major threat in this space are campaigns, then your security posture has to actually be counterfeit. You actually have to continuously be campaigning about the vulnerabilities of others. And ultimately, it's about, can you constrain adversaries' freedom of maneuver and deny them leverage in anticipating crisis and conflict? So that's the structuring ahead. And then we get to the national security strategy released a week or so ago. We argue in the book that we need a paradigm change, right? These things take really, Kuhn said, most people, if you read the book, most people have forgotten what Kuhn was arguing, which was paradigms are really hard to change. That's what that book's about. Everybody took his one term, paradigm change or shift, right? And thought that's what the book was about. The book is about why these things don't change, or why they're so damn sticky, right? So when they do, or they start to take root, that's significant, right? And I give the Biden administration a lot of credit. A lot of people who came or in that administration came from the 2015 era, right? It was all about deterrence, right? 39 pages, the word deter or deterrence does not show up, 0, right? So even under the Trump administration's strategy, it appeared 23 times in 40 pages, just if you want to, right? It's about defending and disrupting. They talk about sustained disruption campaigns. That's their terminology for persistent engagement, which will be the operationalization of the defense strategy. It recognizes we're in a strategic competition over the fundamentals of the space. This is really important. I'd love to get some feedback from you guys about that. What China's trying to do is not just restructure at the operational level, but restructure the structure, right? It's changing the pipes and where they flow, right, and how data. And when we talk about our allies and we talk about whole of nation plus approach, is what we talk about in the book. Really important that this shift in word from partnership, public-private partnership, we've been talking about for 25, 30 years. They talk about collaboration. I think that's a good shift. This notion of rebalancing responsibility to the ISPs, right, to the most capable technical actors in the space, rather than relying on individuals to do, right? That, to me, is really an interesting conceptual shift. We'll see how that actually gets implemented through congressional legislative action. I don't think that's going to happen in any time near term, but it's in the right direction. And so I do believe that we have turned a corner. I've had the privilege of being in meetings with our allies over the last 5 years. It went from, ooh, sounds really aggressive, and like, you guys may like blow up the internet, right? To meetings in this fall, in which is, how do we work at collaborating? How do we play to different skill sets? And how do we build out campaigns and the capacity to counter campaigns? This whole hunt forward piece of this has really been about trust building, right? Because think about it. You're going to let me sit next to you on your network. Yeah, I may be able to provide you more upskilling, right? I may actually be able to provide you defense. But to me, the most important aspect of that is that we've gotten to some level of trust that you believe that I'm not going to leave something behind on your network, right? While I'm helping. And if you can start to build that out, now you're starting to talk about coalitional capacity that could really make it. So let me end with that. I ran over, I apologize, but lots to throw at you. So let's just open up the floor and however, anything that I said or I just totally left off the table and you want to go in a different direction. Floor is yours. Sure.
I believe you talked about this in your paper as well, but can you speak a little bit more on the deterrence by denial? Do you think that deterrence by denial? Do you think that's something that you can do?
So deterrence by denial. Yeah. So so we argue that people have misunderstood deterrence by denial and conflated a lot with defense. Right. So let's put on the table, right? These are two fundamentally different approaches. Right. I'm going to secure if I'm relying on defense, I'm mitigating attack as it's happening. Right. And I have to have a better ability to do that. Deterrence by denial is still prospective threat, right? But this prospective threat is that diminishing return curve that I can convince you that you're going to lose more capability in trying to advance your interest through aggression and not achieve your end. It's a combination of those two, right? It's not simply that I'm banging my head up against the wall, but that banging my head up against the wall gives me a headache, right? So the old notion of the castle wall, the moat, the flaming oil coming over, right? It was that at a point, attrition would set in, right? That you go home because actually continue puts you at a weaker state, right? And now makes you vulnerable. That's the whole point of attrition. So we're arguing in this space, and we're even more explicit in the book, right? That this is not an attrition space. And so therefore the logic of deterrence by denial doesn't hold. Again, that's very different. And we are very explicit in saying you can defend in this space. And defense comes from the ability to anticipate. So that defend forward operation that's been made public at the U.S. Cyber Command was in Ukraine, on Ukraine networks as a hunt forward in October of 2021 for the invasion, right? Find a malware sitting on the Ukrainian railroad that would have shut down the railway, right? You're able to enclave it and leave it. So the Russians actually still believe it's working. So you're gaining TTP, right? You're gaining intelligence. You're actually gaining resiliency at home because you can come back to your rail and transportation networks and say, hey, are these vulnerabilities there? We need to patch them up, right? And the Financial Times of London, I'll leave it, to you all to decide, but 1.2 million Ukrainians escaped Kharkiv and Kyiv in the first week of the war by rail, right? And they don't use cars, this is how you transport those people. And the FTT says, this could be the first cyber operation, defensive operation that saved lives. Right? I don't know, we'll let history determine that, right? But the mechanism of that only happens if you are actually out there setting and resetting the network based on the principles of initiative persistence. Deterrence is still about reaction. Whether you are trying to shape your calculus by punishment, I'm going to impose more costs, right, than you gain by your attack, or I'm going to be so good at defense that you're going to bang your head and you're going to start to attrit. Both of those are still reactive strategies. And in this space, because of the ubiquitousness of technology, its configurability and reconfigurability, right? The opportunity landscape is such that I'm going around your castle wall. I will find that hole, right? Just may take me a little bit more. But if you're valuable enough, I'm going to spend the time to try to figure it out. So we just argue that again, that structural imperative, that security has to be anticipated, and that undermines the application. It's not fun to come to that conclusion, right? Particularly as a deterrence theorist, at my heart, in a different realm. And that's why understanding that we made this leap before, right? If I was sitting down the road in May of 1945, and I was testifying to Congress about what the future of security looked like, and I said to Congress, look, I need you to be prepared to spend trillions of dollars on a military capability whose purpose will be never to be used. And you just want a war, throwing as much material, people, personnel as fast as you could to the front, right? How quick are you throwing me out on the street with that logic, right? Build a military capability whose purpose is never to be used. But one plane, one bomb, one city changed that whole logic, right? And what we're arguing is that we have to be conceptually adept enough to recognize that we've got another technological leap, and that requires a different logic. So yeah, we're holding to our guns. Yes.
So I'm interested in the argument you made about the imperative to seek, or the system, the structure of the system caused an imperative to seek initiative. And what strikes me the most is, I think, the understanding that some of our adversaries have encouraged types of offensive operations that the U.S. by kind of like moral standards won't do. So, for example, like Russia's support of non-state actors in cyberspace, or China's like IP theft, are both things that the U.S. historically has not supported ourselves doing. So my main question is it possible for the U.S. to kind of overcome this kind of barrier where our adversaries, by moral grounds, kind of have more ways to seek initiative in the U.S.? Kind of how does the theory address that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And look, part of the criticism of the theory, right, is that this seems to be, my good friend Jay Healy will accuse us of saying, well, this can just be perpetual conflict, perpetual war. And I say, no, it's perpetual competition, right? And that's a big difference. So our argument is that we actually, cyberspace is, if you look at it empirically, right, there's an agreed competition already going on, right? It's below the threshold of territorial armed attack, right? In the advancement of it. So these actors that are doing things that we might not otherwise want to do, that we think are off the table, are doing it though, but they're really short of going near that war limit, right? That's interesting to me. We argue that there is a strategic choice being made that reinforces that structural imperative. If I can persist below that level in advance, or have the prospect of advance, remember, I don't need to succeed every day. I just need to think I can, right? To perpetuate this dynamic. If I think I can, then I'm going to actually reinforce that, right? So then the question is, I would argue that for up until the last few years, we've been playing football while everybody else has been playing football, right? But we've been showing up with helmets, pads, this oblong ball that you actually don't kick that much, right? Episodic, you line up players, they're in their certain roles. Well, everybody else has been playing with this round ball, very light accoutrements on, flexible defenders and offensive players moving all over the place. So we've just actually shown up on it and realized what the game is. We don't know what the red card and yellow cards are, except at that high level. We know what seemingly would be considered armed attack equivalents, right? So, not Petya 2017, right? Hell of a lot of collateral damage, right? Maersk going down, actually flowing back to your own set, right? Pretty messy. We don't know whether the Russians were just sloppy, whether they didn't care, or whether that was purposeful. Most analysis that I've seen wasn't purposeful, right? So it's either in the sloppy or we were just focused on the Ukrainians. We didn't think it through, right? Fast forward to SolarWinds, right? It's the same vector attack, right? It's leveraging third-party update effective, right? Really clean, really quiet, very targeted, expansive, but controlled expansion, right? From our theoretical standpoint, we argue that the Russians learn. There's learning in this space, behaviorally over time, right? As somebody who tries to help support US national security, am I happy about SolarWinds? Not in the least, right? But I would much prefer SolarWinds than to not pay it, right? So if over time we've got less collateral damage across networks, and I'm using that term, in this case, that you're affecting third parties that are not part of what your directed operation is about, right? That's actually potentially a good thing, right? You're just getting better. We better get better. Hafnium, right? That's really bad stuff. Leaving back doors open so you have actually collateral agency, right? You just let criminal activity to come in behind you, right? And you can talk to the Chinese and you can say, hey, look, you're going to do this, right? In the end, that's not helping at the state level, right? You guys got to clean that. So I think you're still at a stage early. We're still very early into this. I think there's a hell of a lot of experimentation. So I don't think the other side is 10 feet tall, right? They're good, we're good, right? But we're not gonna be perfect. They're not gonna be perfect. So what I think is important for us on the academic side, to the degree that we can, is there a pattern of learning, and where is that pattern going? And it seems to me that empirically that pattern has tended to be, let's keep this below anything of below armed attack. Let's become more effective at trying to mess with relative power cumulatively and essentially agree to a competition space, right? The most important thing about us from a US perspective is to understand that that competition space is now a strategic space. It could, and this is what we argue in the book, be the alternative. The step up in AI is where this is going to, we're trying to anticipate in the theory where this is going, right? And we argue the capacity to exploit and defend, it's going to be on both sides, but that's only going to become hyper, right, as we move forward. So we have to at least have the prospect, right? The accumulation is going to accelerate. And if that prospect is there, I would anticipate that these actors are going to just get better. If we see patterns where this thing goes off, and critics of the theory and the more critics of the strategy argue, well, there's this escalation, right, and interaction kind of thing. It's a really active space, and we're not seeing. So what explains that, right? And at least we argue that it's a combination of the structure itself, right, is macro level resilient while micro level vulnerable. So it absorbs a lot of this. And there's strategic choice, right, to keep this within this game. Because one game. So I'll leave one, Ravel's reaction to Colonial pipeline was really interesting, right? Because what did they do? They immediately went with, whoa, that wasn't what we meant to do, right? Why? Because they went after administrative systems. It's Colonial that shuts down the operations side, right? Because they hadn't segmented their network. But now you have a critical infrastructure attack flow from that. And it was fascinating, right, to see their reaction was immediately to say, whoa, that's overshoot. Why is it overshoot? Because if they want to make money, they don't want Cyber Command coming back and taking down their server, right? And they don't want DOJ on their backs in terms of taking down their finances. So there's even on the criminal side, right? A space in which, you know, I'm gonna try to keep this as much as limited as possible, right? Below certain thresholds so that I can make as much.
So you somewhat answered my question, I guess. I was just trying to toy with the idea of kind of wondering what the conversations sound like surrounding that point in time in which a reaction to a cyber attack would get kinetic. What does it look like as you know, the Starlink and the people supplying it and the companies supplying it? Are they legal targets for an adversary to physically go in and like eliminate? I was just kind of curious what some of the conversations around that
Yeah,
sound.
no, those are great question. So I'm not sanguine, right, that agreed competition just holds, right, because it holds, right? Again, that's why that strategic choice is important. You look at the Iranian-Israeli, you know, they've come up to the edge of the water, I would argue, right? And I'm not really happy about, we can push this a little too far, right? Again, interesting though, what's the dynamic? They tend to pull back when they get up to that water's edge, right? So JD Work and I did a piece for Atlantic Council on Iran and Israel a little bit. So again, there's this self-restraint aspect, but it's not coming from deterrence. We argue it's not coming from deterrence. We argue it's coming from strategic advantage calculation, right? Why mess with a good thing, right? If this space is this opportunity, you know, creates reward for opportunity, why am I gonna blow that system up, right? But as we've seen, right, in the Russian-Ukraine case, pretty big significant powers can decide kinetic conventional warfare, armed aggression is what I need to do to advance my interests. Then cyber becomes an enabling military capacity, right? It's part and parcel of war, and that goes into the whole war logic. So one of the things that I think is really interesting for those of you that are studying this space and want to kind of contemplate where to go with some new research questions is that crisis space, right? So CPT would suggest to you that if these tools, if we look at cyber and say they're not coercive tools, right, they're exploitation tools, then the area where we should see the least amount of application of cyber power is actually in crisis, right? If your goal in crisis is not to go to war, right? But if you're approaching crisis as a management tool, right, and you're trying to manage it. These things are not good signals. They're in fact not signals at all because they're not coercive tools, right? So where do they, so are they just off the table? You don't think about cyber as it relates to crisis, and we would argue no, right? When you want to go and be in a crisis, that you've structured the crisis to advantage you over your adversary, right? So how do you do that? Is it through cyber-enabled information operations as prelude, right? Is it setting the conditions in which that crisis would occur? I would argue that the Russians did none of that, right? And so part of their problem with cyber-enabled information operations afterwards is you've already lost that moral component, right? You've already crossed over. I'm already in a war. So if I'm sitting in Beijing and I know that the United States and I disagree over the fate of Taiwan, right? Crises are not surprises, the timing of crises. Right? So we know where our points of potential conflict. I'm not making it that easy for the US population to decide, the European, and I'm not making it that easy for Starlink to make that decision or Microsoft. So I'm going to start to set the conditions for that much earlier, right? Where, former National Cyber Mission Force Commander Rear Admiral TJ White and I were bouncing back drafts of an editorial that we're going to offer to the Post. Everybody's been doing this lessons of Ukraine on cyber. The one area that we think is a real big gap is the emergence of independent corporate cyber power from a military planning standpoint. Right? So we're arguing in this editorial that we actually have to move away from thinking about them as corporations that make money and therefore should be handled through regulatory frameworks, and think about them as independent cyber powers that you have to actually diplomatically engage with and plan on your military side. So if I had an actor, if I had a state that was out there that could affect the military balance in war, right? In a potential area where I would have interests, what's the normal thing you do? What do you do? What do you guys do studying in a school of foreign affairs, right? You go out and you start diplomatic negotiations with them. You start having conversations about, under these conditions, how are you going to act? And how are we going to act, right? And we're going to come to some agreement. If we come to an agreement to coordinate, right, we may call you a partner. If we actually come to an agreement of like, this is how we're going to military plan this, you become an ally, right? You sign a treaty. I know that sounds like we're going to sign a treaty with Elon Musk over where Starlink. But think about that from a terrestrial space, right? That's what we do with states that could militarily affect or operationally affect the military balance. What do we do with these actors who can independently affect, right? The time to figure that out is not in a crisis, not after tanks have rolled, right? It's now, right? So what Microsoft did in terms of moving the Ukrainian capabilities to the cloud, right, happened. I mean, no state could have pulled that, right? So these are the types of things that we have to figure out. And to me, it's not sufficient what Eric Schmidt told me, right? They were American companies, so therefore we follow America. I don't think that's the way to manage this, right? I don't think we think about regulating. They're going to have to make decisions in these kinds of gray spaces. And so how do we manage that? And what's interesting about the national cyber strategy is if you accept this notion that there's now a grand strategic competition going on, right? In which very reasonably Beijing feels it has a model of governance. It wants to align the technical space to that governance structure. That's all we're doing, right? We had first mover advantage, right? So the architecture of the global internet kind of marries up with liberal democratic principles, right? But it was really about power projection, right? It's not a liberal ideological. It's about power projection. We developed the model. We thought it was really sticky. We thought everybody's going to buy into it, right? And now you got an alternative, right? So I would argue that, realism can explain a lot of what we're seeing in this space, right? But we can't lose sight of the importance of neoliberal institutionalism at the operational technical level. You guys know this better than not, for those of you that are in that space, right? We made decisions in 2008 and 2010 about DNS and where we sit on international multi-stakeholder position. You look at the effort that the Chinese are making on a diplomatic level to infuse themselves at the standards level, the standards making body. I would argue that's really good strategic behavior, right? So you're doing it at the technical level, you're doing it at the standards level, right? And you've built this into your economic development, right, to the digital Silk Road and the Belt and Road aspects, right? That's really good stuff. Again, I don't want to put people on 10-foot pole, but that's what you should be doing as a strategic act, right? So I think what's interesting is both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, two administrations you wouldn't think would be syncing up, seem to be syncing up, right, in the way that they're looking at this space. Right? And to me, that's a good sign that thoughtful people who maybe have been in a different place are actually being open to new constructs, looking at empirical evidence and saying, yeah, that seems to explain it better, right, than that square peg, right? And you know, I'm old enough to remember this. You guys, good that you're young enough, maybe not to, right? You know, we had 70, 75 years of strategic competition with the Soviet Union, right? That didn't go to global war. Nukes in my mind, had a big role in that, right? Takes great power competition between the United States and its adversaries off the table. We can't be sanguine that that's the only way to lose relative power. Right? Is cyberspace truly strategic? So I've got a book chapter coming out with Bobby Chesney and Max Sneeds and others, and it's about this. Cyberspace is really just about intelligence contests, right? And it's about deception, and you know, we argue no, it's a strategic space. The scale, scope, and speed at which you can move core sources of national power put this in a qualitatively different space than just espionage and deception. Those principles are important, and they have some aspects at the operational level, but this is something qualitatively different, right? If we're wrong, then we've overshot, right? And I don't know the downside really of that per se. If we're right and we don't treat it, if we still play football when everybody else is playing football, right? We've got a real problem. So our hope is that this space has reinforcing competitive things that we can be in this for a long time. We'll have good days, we'll have bad days, we'll have OPMs, right? But so will they, right? And the question is can you find and strike a balance? And you asked that one other question about things that seem to be, you know, we won't do. That's also a signaling, and I use that word very intentionally, from a policy standpoint, right? But that's a choice on our part to win without conceding civil liberties, without conceding. And I'll give you one of the things that was most pleasing about going into these agencies as an academic was just to see how committed those folks that are on the government side are to making sure that if we win by holding up our principles, right, and not doing that. That does put us at a disadvantage. You just have to accept that, right? That there's a built-in structural disadvantage, right? So then how do you make up for it? You train better, you innovate better, right? And you take advantages that our system provides. That's innovation, that's we trust the edge a lot more than authoritarian systems can. There's advantages in that. So I think part of, you know, security studies analysis too, I'd encourage you to think through that, right? How does governance and value systems actually structure different approaches to how you're going to compete, right? And so then I just violated realist principles by saying, yeah, at the macro level, realism probably can explain this better, but the solution is how do you play to your relative advantages, right? And yeah, there's downsides too, a heck of a lot of benefit if we just get it done. I know we ran over, but I hope that it gave you guys some grist for the mill to chew on. I've got 2 copies of the book. how do we distribute? So anybody who tells me that they really actually would read the thing, I'd be happy to give you a copy, or we can arm wrestle. I don't know, but you've got one, so that's great.
I mean, I will genuinely read it unless someone else is
All right,
super into it.
you good?
Probably bring it to my eyes.
Apologize, I didn't have more, but
Thank you.
so thanks for your interest in it. To those online, thank you for joining us. And what I'd ask is your generation of scholarship, right? I'm an old guy in this, right? But your generation of scholarship is going to actually help us innovate on this. So to the extent that you can advance it through critique, send those critiques to us, right? And to the extent that you can use it effectively to illuminate things that may have not been as clear before, please do that and let us know how that work is doing. Again, we're still in the infancy stage of all of this. So more brain power, more eyes on it, the better it's going to become. Thanks for an engaging afternoon. I hope that was useful for you all.